entitled Nature and Nihilism, the Political Theology of the Dark Enlightenment. And the first paper will be presented by Courtney and Hodrick from Stanford University, and her paper is entitled From Dark Enlightenment to Alt-Right.
Good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to speak about the neo-reactionary political movement which emerged toward the end of the first decade of this century, and which philosopher Nick Land brought to increased prominence in early 2013 and renamed in popular discourse with his essay, The Dark Enlightenment. While this movement's rejection of liberal democracy has led it to be viewed by many as a precursor to the right-wing populism generally referred to in American context as the alt-right, I intend to challenge this characterization. Where some see a genealogy, I instead posit a dichotomy. By analyzing neo-reaction through the writings of Carl Schmitt, I will argue that its political theology is a fundamentally liberal one. This liberalism is best observed in three aspects of the neo-reactionary project. First, in the rejection of violence as an existential horizon of human political life. Second, in the subsequent depoliticizing turn towards formalism and markets as the key legitimating mechanisms. And finally, in the emphasis on migration and egress rights. Moreover, I suggest that it is this essential liberalism that explains why neo-reaction was never able to pose a successful challenge to the liberal democratic order. Instead, this order was shaken by a populism that, in a Schmittian view, contains not only democracy's worst sins, but also its vitalizing spark. This characterization may come as a surprise to some of you. After all, these are the geeks for monarchy, as one think piece characterized them. Moreover, the neo-reactionary movement owes a clear debt to Schmitt, who could hardly be mistaken for a proponent of liberalism. It serves to begin, then, with an explication of neo-reaction's two most Schmittian moves, some of their more familiar analytic postures, before I turn to the main thrust of my argument. My primary focus of inquiry today will be the writings of Curtis Yarvin, who blogged under the name Mencius Moldbug from about 2006 until 2013, and in whose work the Schmittian inheritance is clear. Yarvin brought political theology to a new generation in his blog Unqualified Reservations by detailing the extra-political apparatus of elite universities, mainstream publications, and NGOs, which he termed the cathedral, aimed at the propagation of a politically correct theology of democratic egalitarianism that was rightly identified by Yarvin as an intensification of a particularly English strain of Protestant thought. Yarvin further shows his debt to Schmitt by pointing out a fundamental contradiction at the heart of liberal democracy. In Yarvin's analysis of modern American politics, democracy comes into conflict with liberty by subjugating the individual to the rule of the mob. Democracy must only ever flow leftwards, he argues, as the people demand more and more from their government, and the closed circuit between Harvard and Washington brings more and more power to the cathedral. As Nick Land puts it, democracy is not only or even a system, but rather a vector. For Schmitt, the crisis of parliamentary democracy lies in its being torn between two incompatible legitimating mechanisms, between dialectical parliamentarism, which cannot reconcile mutually exclusive normative positions, and the general will, which demands that we legitimate our government by constructing a homogeneous artifice called the people. Nowhere in this critique do we find direction, trajectory, or teleology. Yarvin and Land's failure to imagine a rightwards moving democracy is thus the first clue that their thought may be closer to the cathedral's mainstream than they would like to believe. Taking a closer look at Yarvin's writings, we'll find many more. Although the movement that sprung up around his blog came to be known as neo-reaction, a new heir to the Jacobite monarchist tradition, Yarvin's own preferred term for his politics was formalism. He presented perhaps the most concise distillation of his political views in A Formalist Manifesto, originally published April of 2007. Yarvin, quote, decided to build a new ideology, he explains. Formalism is what he comes up with. The kernel idea of formalism, the first principle upon which he builds, is quite simple. Quote, The main problem with human affairs is violence. The goal is to design a way for humans to interact on a planet of remarkably limited size without violence. He tells us that, and I quote again, the key is to look at this not as a moral problem, but as an engineering problem. He was a software engineer. But in the interest of being contrarian, I want to look at violence instead as an existential problem. I find it telling that the type of violence about which he is most worried is what he calls organized human-on-human violence. He is not wrong to look back on the 20th century in horror and to long for a politics free from enmity or war. Nevertheless, Schmitt poses a clear challenge to such a goal when he states, in the concept of the political, that the friend-enemy distinction that forms the lifeblood of the political is not a mere figure of speech. These terms, he wrote, received their real meaning precisely because they refer to the real possibility of physical killing. Violence, for Schmitt, is the existential horizon of political activity. It is the possibility contained within the moment of political decision. Yarvin does not even dispute this definition. Politics and war are a continuum, he acknowledges, and the only way to avoid war is to eschew democracy and with it politics, or perhaps vice versa. Of course, Schmitt would have some choice words here. He would remind his would-be disciple that even those who retreat from the political cannot escape from it. Any people which attempted to do so would simply fall under the sway of whichever group was willing to protect them. It is surprising that, for all Yarvin's concern for sovereignty, for all his self-positioning as a prophet of forbidden truth, he fails to acknowledge this existential reality. At some point, Yarvin's belief in sovereignty and his desire to avoid political violence must necessarily come into conflict. Of course, despite his distaste for violence, we can hardly go about accusing Yarvin of pacifism. If anything, his concern is answering the question posed by the Weberian model of the state. It is deciding who has the monopoly on the legitimate use of violence. For Yarvin, the real is the economic. His formalist manifesto attempts to short-circuit the question of legitimacy. He does not care who should own a particular unit of territory, but only who already actually does. Formalism, then, is the granting of formalized contractual legitimacy to the existing structures of ownership of political, physical, and cultural capital alike. He puts it quite simply, and here I quote again. So this is the formalist manifesto, that the US is just a corporation. What he suggests we do with the United States, and perhaps with every nation state, is nothing short of corporate takeover. Reformalize the assets, liquidate if necessary, and then let the shareholders decide what to do with this economic venture. In his essay proposing the patchwork system, which I will discuss in greater detail in a moment, he suggests that patches of land could have any lifestyle or culture they wanted, so long as there was a market for that lifestyle. Moreover, they could in theory have any organizational structure they wanted, but they would inevitably fall against the joint stock corporations in their ruthless efficiency. As he explains, if there existed a more effective structure, if firms were more productive when managed not by a committee, but by an executive, or by the collective decisions of their customers or employees, by separate legislative and judiciary branches, etc., and here the analogy to democracy is clear, we would know. Someone would have found a way to construct a firm on this design, and it would have outcompeted the rest of the stodgy old world. I want to really dig into this turn towards the economic, because it is here that neo-reaction shows its affinities with libertarianism, or, as they still often call it, classical liberalism. Schmitt saw the claimed autonomy of economics as the most important of liberalism's depoliticizations, and he showed perhaps his most leftist streak in pointing out the ideology lurking behind the perceived neutrality of the economic sphere. He reminds us of the tendency of relationships of exchange to, quote, deteriorate into a system of the worst exploitation and repression. He even concludes the concept of the political by warning of the consequences of an economically justified imperialism. Let it suffice here to say that an economic turn is insufficient to avoid violence. Nevertheless, I believe it is Schmitt's intrinsic critique of liberalism that most speaks to the existential void at the center of neo-reaction. Neo-reaction inherits from libertarianism an anthropology in which the individual features as the essential political unit. The problem with this, Schmitt tells us, is that, quote, no consistent individualism can entrust to someone other than to the individual himself the right to dispose of the physical life of the individual. And what that means for Schmidt is that liberalism cannot legitimate a society capable of making claims upon its members, and thus cannot furnish a positive political platform. I want to turn briefly and finally to Yarvin's attempt at a positive platform to explain why it still falls into the same liberal depoliticization. Yarvin describes in an essay of the same name his positive view of a society he terms patchwork. It is thus called, he explains, because it replaces the dysfunctional governments and nation-states left over from the 20th century with, and here I'm quoting, a global spiderweb of tens, even hundreds of thousands of sovereign and independent mini-countries, each governed by its own joint stock corporation without regard to the residents' opinions. Our relationship to these states will, of course, be that of customers, not of citizens. Quote again, to live on a patchwork patch, you have to sign a bilateral contract with the realm. You promise to be a good boy and behave yourself. The realm promises to treat you fairly. Of course, Yarvin delivers his vision with his tongue firmly planted in his cheek, but I want to take seriously his model of how the individual protects her flourishing against a potentially predatory government. Yarvin's ideal political society holds the right of egress as its essential grounding. Once he has jettisoned political freedom, replacing it with the personal freedom of contracts and markets, the customer's veto becomes the only check on power. As he tells us, if residents don't like their government, they can and should move. It is, in short, all exit, no voice. Perhaps unsurprisingly, there is very little mention of culture in this essay. Yarvin only concerns himself with the possibility that, like North Korea today, a state could effectively trap its citizens within its border. It is striking that his answer to this problem is, once again, a return to economics. He points out that a country of slaves is hardly an effective way for rulers to ensure a return on their investments. He fails to account for regimes predicated on an ideology, religious or otherwise, whose members themselves actually believe in that ideology. He doesn't imagine that a child, born into a patch with a model of flourishing that proved alien to their own, could grow into an adult who was forced to choose between their own self-assertion and the community that had nurtured them. He is so deep in the logic of individualization that he doesn't even realize that this choice could be a hard one. Nick Lamb sees exit as the essential Anglo-American political action. He tells us, when Anglophones disagree, they have often sought to dissociate in space. Instead of an integral resolution, regime change, they pursue a plural irresolution through regime division, proliferating polities, localizing power, and diversifying systems of government. If this sounds familiar to you, it's because it's also the basic thesis Schmidt makes in his work Land and Sea. And now, I want to be honest that Schmidt's opposition of the terrestrial to the thalassic mode of existential politics is one of the moments in his thought that gives me the most pause. Gluten Boden, after all, can be a dangerous foundation for politics. But what the substitution of exit for voice demands of us is nothing less than that we weaken the ties that bind us to families, friends, and communities, so that we might be ready at any moment to take flight. Moreover, patchwork only works, really, if all the patches are the same. The rejection of a homogenized Europe by right-wing anti-EU parties suggests that humanity longs for uniqueness, for a belonging predicated on difference. And if there's one thing that the current clamor to build a wall on the southern border of this country shows us, it's that terrestrial politics remains an appealing mode. In short, the neo-reactionaries attempted to solve the contradiction at the core of liberal democracy by jettisoning the latter term. In contrast, I understand the alt-right as embodying the worst of the sins that Schmidt and the neo-reactionaries alike attributed to democracy. Its pursuit of a homogenized body politic, its fierce identification of internal enemies, and even the descent into irrationalism. Schmidt warned us in the end of his Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy that in hopes of a revitalized parliamentarism, this parliamentarism cannot content itself with repeating the question, parliamentarism, what else? Neo-reaction, it is clear, has not provided a satisfactory answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our next paper is by Tim Luke.
from Virginia Tech. His paper is entitled Readings from the Book of Third Nature as Political Theology, The Dark Enlightenment.
Okay, so Courtney covered some of the bits about Curtis Yarder, which I thought was very useful. So I'll sort of bounce around within the paper, trying to develop politics, and then maybe, if you will, a kind of, is there a political theology here? So a few facets of this, fairly complex but strangely attractive movement, the Dark Enlightenment, are in order. But where does it stand? Because of its links to the alt-right and many of its supporters' ties to Silicon Valley-centered venture capitalists, cyber-like libertarians, corporate entrepreneurs, one should not ignore its political agendas or its ideological affectations. In many ways, this movement is maybe just the latest twist of the so-called ongoing California ideology that spun up in the 1990s, which at one time was thought to be bringing a cyber communism to the United States through the internet economy of freeware in the 1990s. But after 2 decades of economic booms and more prolonged economic busts, some might see a reactionary modernism developing here that gripped the imagination of some people in these circles, and the Dark Enlightenment is one of its aspects. Yet, this is kind of strange. In many ways, I think it is a profoundly liberal moment, because how can you be a neo-reactionary? There's a strange ideological, political, sociological grounding that's very unusual here. First, it develops in the United States, a country without an established church, a feudal aristocracy, or a once well-entrenched peasant economy. So how can you be a neo-reactionary when you have very little awareness of what a paleo-reactionary is? Within the high technology industries made profitable by heavy government investment and regulation, they claim to be radical libertarian anti-status, presuming that their science, technology, and engineering degree, or just their, fantastic coding skills, made them rich by dint of all those all-nighters before the screen pounding down Red Bulls. In a constitutional republic allegedly devoted to the sustainable development of an egalitarian industrial democracy for millions of hardworking consumers, striving to acquire many of the goods and services these same high-tech firms produce, they denounce democratic equality, the masses, and individual choice, fearing that such popular choices really are basically a scheme to raise taxes on the entrepreneurial digitality, and they know that those monies are going to be frittered away on the undeserving poor in minority underclass households. So, according to the hardcore neo-reactionaries, as Land would say, this kind of democracy is not merely doomed, it's doom itself. Predisposed in any case to perceive the politically awakened masses as a howling irrational mob that considers the dynamics of democratization as fundamentally degenerative, systematically consolidating and exacerbating private vices, resentments, and deficiencies until they reach a level of collective criminality and comprehensive social corruption. The Democratic politician and electorate are bound together by a circuit of reciprocal incitement, which each side drives the other to ever more shameless extremities of hooting, prancing, cannibalism, until the only alternative left is to be eaten. So, you can see there's a lot of excitement in the rhetoric here, but it kind of opposes the two choices made in the 18th century between, to say, what you might call the bright Enlightenment versus this one here in the dark Enlightenment. For Land, essentially what's going on is basically appetites. It accepts governments are made of people, and how do you control this? There isn't much attention paid to the fact that in the progressive Enlightenment in the United States, we have figures like James Madison, John Jay, Hamilton, Franklin, John Adams, who also shared this suspicion of democracy that they embedded in the architecture of the Constitution, wrote out in the pages of the Federalist Papers, and even explicated in the Bill of Rights. All of this is a little bit ignored by the neo-reactionaries, but in many ways it fits their liberal predisposition, so of course, why not ignore it? What's kind of interesting in many ways is the choices between autocracy and democracy, which I think are sort of centered in the cyber sagas of, if you will, the neo-reaction or NRX. Many of these folks, ironically, see themselves not unlike the electro-existentialists and cyber warriors of the Matrix film trilogy. They're Neo in a world. The screenshot world views, of course, of this are kind of a raw epistemic elitism. They're the special few choosing the red pill in its wonderland over the blue pill of clueless unawareness. On the other hand, they appraise Wonderland's workings as they appraise it. They slightly conflate their personal success and hard work in celebrating today's high-tech illiberal Courtocracy as they're laboring away for FANG capital, Facebook, Apple, Netflix, Google, also sometimes holding solid personal positions in those same companies, which fuels their libertarianism. It may be slightly tied to self-service, but as we know from some of the heads of these well-placed, Silicon Valley companies, this is not unlike the kind of consciousness of the robber barons of the Gilded Age before trust busting broke up those big bank, oil, railway, and steel monopolies of that era, as some people want to break up the search, online sale, and provision of cybernetic kinds of ideas these days in the future. So then I talk a little bit about, the accelerationists and how this is tied in many ways to the accelerationist creed. Accelerationism is essentially a kind of updated sort of futurism where the goal of accelerationism is to hasten the eventual transformative collapse, reinvention of capitalism by pushing it as far as possible. Ironically, the first accelerationist, you may not have known this, was Marx, Karl Marx. Acceleration is a political heresy, the insistence that the only radical political response to capitalism is not protest, to disrupt or critique or await its demise in the hands of its own contradictions, but to accelerate its uprooting, alienating, decoding, and abstracted tendencies. So from this, you can get these kind of sci-fi-based notions in cyberspace of how to accelerate the collapse. Here I start talking about some of the key philosophers of the Dark Enlightenment, which are a curious combination of individuals. Yarvin's the best well-known. And I kind of draw some connections between their Alain Vital with another one-time Bay Area thinker about advanced capitalism, Ted Kaczynski, another visionary who took his fight against industrial society and its future to direct towards primitivism. Of course, he saw Silicon Valley also seizing hold of the future of industrial society, but the Unabomber was not entirely off target, yet he was violent. So instead of having Unabombers, what we tend to have now are very peaceful Unibloggers. It's more about throwing information bombs at the modern world system, and you can read those or Land or Nullus Maximus or Social Matter, but they're proud to take on this name of neo-reaction for themselves. And it's a little bit of rhetorical grandstanding, a little bit of liberalism, but ultimately it's kind of this weird mix of anarchism, anti-humanism, authoritarianism, this kitsch culture of corporate futurism, sci-fi sagas, and libertarian economics, all of which is fascinating to read. It continues to generate at a rapid rate of speed. And I'm reading a lot about it, but in many ways I think you captured very well. It's very liberal. It's extremely caught up with the American political imaginary. The other day when we were listening to David's framing of political theology, I think some of what they're doing is intriguing in terms of reimagining political theology as a political representation of a past and a future history through an aesthetic or an ethical political vision of the person and place in the context of the present, which can be tied in an aesthetic judgment and affect rather to some abstract, rational, universal principles and reasoned judgment. So whether it's Wonderland, topping the cathedral, acceleration of sagas, or other sci-fi, cli-fi, goth-fi fables, these representations anchor a kind of political theology which goes beyond the materiality of the terrestrial, as one might see in the book of First Nature received from the cosmos, from God, or the ancient aliens, as some ancient alien theorists believe, who got here before us, or of territoriality of the modern world system constructed by capitalism and sovereignty to what we might call telemetricality, or that of cyberspace, of a third nature. It's virtual, it's hyperreal. And caught up within the spatiality is a connection to materiality through the electromechanical mediation of the internet, as well as a representationality in which amorphously fuses acts of intellect and will within, the spaces where the people who take the red pill could see it. All right, so in the paper then I kind of talked about cyberspace and, we kind of are all up on that. What is it? Well, it's a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation by children being taught mathematical concepts, a graphic representation of data abstracted in the banks of every computer in the human system, unthinkable complexity, lines of light range in the non-space of the mind, clusters and constellations of data like city lights receding, as you know, William Gibson's characterization. This language is spiritual, transcendent, mysterious. Its coders maybe even are liturgically charged, have a new liturgically charged lingo of a new Illuminati, and they feel the omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience of divinity floating around in this digitality. And with that, I think you tend to see many advocates of the Dark Enlightenment naturalizing cyberspace as a given, as it can be and will be accessed at will by anyone astute enough and well-equipped enough to gain entry and read Uniblogger wisdom, maybe all the way down to the, past the WYSIWYG level to talking directly to the interface of the machine. And all of the NRX networks, there's a kind of an occult out-of-bound feeling here where you can't talk to us, the normies, because they shouldn't be granted complete access, authority, or acceptance to that realm already gained by the digerati. Cybernetic control is a realm of experience, the grounds of their autocratic authority, and the foundation, arguably perhaps, of a new kind of political theology. So here I sort of talk a little bit, and wind up, but there's a lot more here that I'm trying to say. I think the accelerationists in Dark Enlightenment really put the digital metal to the cybernetic metal. Because what they're trying to arguably say is that beyond what Nick Lang calls our bionic horizon, there is the opportunity to merge two realms of information, that of wetware in cells and DNA, and that in software and hardware and firmware and netware in codes. And that in that, there's a kind of techno-chauvinism that one sees, the belief that tech is always the solution, because putatively, after all, we see the Microsoft commercials, it's radical, it's revolutionary, and it's revelatory, right? So what digital technology has been doing, but it's kind of conventional, it's also been part of our lives since the 50s, definitely since the 80s, but it is still nonetheless brought out as something that is anti-systemic. And in many ways, in being anti-systemic, kind of then starts to slide down the alt-right hill in some weird ways. For Land, the cathedral that Goldbug savages pits a leftish wallowing against NRX wisdom in nature-nurture terms. As the suppressive orthodoxy of the cathedral becomes unstrung, it is the time of monsters that we find approaching. Putting it in the crudest terms, he says, the right likes genes and the left likes culture. So here we have is where hereditary determinism confronts social constructivism, unable to accept the culture of practical naturalism, which is that of techno-scientific industrial manipulation of the world, or how do we get cells and code to interact? Here, then, third nature becomes kind of intriguing. Digitality begins to reprogram animality, driving the divinity for deeper revelations, realizing that nature and culture compose a dynamic circuit at the edge of nature, where the fate of man is decided. Land asserts codes and cells can fuse together on a material transcendence, our bionic horizon, the threshold of a conclusive nature-culture fusion in which the population becomes indistinguishable from its technology. Like Octavia Butler's, if you read sci-fi, Xenogenesis trilogy, very interesting stuff, where gene traders have no identity separate from their biotechnological program, where they perpetually implement upon themselves as they conventionally acquire and industrially produce and sexually reproduce their population from within a single integral process. But this radical political theology, even though their revelations betray some kinships to some even stranger cults, this libertarianism at the root of this becomes kind of strange because it amounts to a kind of auto-Aryanization. All right, that is, beyond the religious traditionalists of the Western orthosphere, the Dark Enlightenment envisions how, quote, techno-scientific auto-production specifically supplants the fixed and sacralized essence of man as a created being, amidst the greatest upheaval of natural order since the emergence of eukaryotic life 500 million years ago. It's not merely an evolutionary event, but the threshold of a new evolutionary phase of Homo ad autocatalypticus. Here is where telemetricality pays off in this speciation talk. It pretends to avoid racism, but this reading from the third nature, it gets a little dangerous. One of their fellow travelers is a group called Creative Conscious Evolution. There, you see the tenor and tone of such auto-Aryanization for the autocatalypticus. As John H. Campbell at University of California at UCLA biologist suggests, quote, we shall soon be able to redesign our biological selves at will. And his followers see this claim justifying the abandonment of Homo sapiens as a relic, a living fossil. The application of genetic technologies shall intrude upon the genome using DNA synthesizers. Such eugenics would be practiced by elite groups whose achievements would so quickly and radically outdistance the usual tempo of evolution that within 10 generations, new groups shall have advanced beyond our current form to the same degree that we, meaning, people, transcend apes. These CRISPR-coated beings will coexist with Homo sapiens, but like the latter, they will be Neanderthals. Before them, maybe they'll be seen as Zelizianthal people or something like that. Men and women where the autocatalyptici will be these technoplastic beings who are susceptible to precise, scientifically informed transformations that arise from humanity's subsumption of its own technosphere in which they will embed in their being itself. Land is a little coy, but his favorite source, again, of such thinking is Campbell, who's a lot more forthright. He says, I predict human destiny is to elevate itself above to the status of a god and beyond. Likewise, they're a little mute about which humans are going to do this, but MajorityRights.com, which is another one of their associated groups, says it's really clear who's going to do this. It's going to be native European nationalists in alliance with ethnogenetic interests, ethnocrats, and of course the Euro DNA nation. Campbell's kind of goes along with that. That's just extra Darwinian evolution. Of course it's going to be elitist. Of course it's going to be self-referential. And it's going to be a generative process because it's going to be private human evolution. In other words, it's going to take a lot of cash. So the Dark Enlightenment's leanings toward this kind of techno-theosophy, if you will, on the one hand, they're very high-tech, but on the other hand, they're sort of high-minded insurrection intent upon burning down more than just the cathedral. In their accelerationist, elitist, and separatist aspirations, the apotheosis of auto-Aryanization, the Dark Enlightenment digerati are very forthright, and they begin to prove, Pace, Horkheimer, and Adorno, ironically, that indeed the dialectics of the Dark Enlightenment lead apparently, or can lead apparently, contingently, to a darker, digitalized, gene-edited, and technoplastic barbarism. And I think that's where the neo-reaction stands. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Next paper is by Adrian at University of Kent. Paper is entitled Transhumanism and the Political Theology of Paradox.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to Tim and Courtney, because they really set this up brilliantly and beautifully, and in fact this was totally uncoordinated, so that's really wonderful. I want to start with this term of paradox, just to say that a paradox, quite simply, is something that looks incompatible and contradictory, but turns out to be coherent. Okay, you might say it looks wrong, but turns out to be right. And really the starting point, in very broad terms, is to say that since the English Civil War and the French Revolution, much of the West, but not all, has sort of, or much of Western politics, I should say, has really been governed by all sorts of binaries, left, right, state, market, individual, collective, you know them all. But in this, our age of disruption, and indeed I'm sure previously, these all opposites simply don't capture our reality, and they certainly don't capture the sort of alternatives available to us. And this is, I think, where paradox matters. So if you just start politically very simply, we see all sorts of insurgents around the West, the far left and the far right, but most of the time, in fact, they are both far left and far right. Take the Lega in Italy, and in government with the Five-Star Movement, right? This is the Lega committed to a far-right politics with draconian limits on immigration and a kind of atavistic discourse on identity, and then the Five-Star Movement that wants a kind of universal basic income and welfare for the indigenous population. So, the same will be true for Marine Le Pen and lots of others. But then we also have formations of market states and state markets all over the place. Right? So after the financial crisis of 2008, the state's been bailing out banks, which really means that the market state, serving the interests of capital, has now evolved into also being a state market. Governments assume private liabilities and central banks buy state bonds, and that now has become essential to the management of an economy that's entirely dependent on debt. So states and markets collude in different ways at the expense of the needs of most people and society at large. And then the last paradox to mention at this point is the individual and the collective, because the rampant individualism that we associate with contemporary liberal politics, perhaps not all liberal politics, also is a major reason for why we have these authoritarian populist reactions now. So you could say rampant individualism actually begets authoritarian statism, because of course the far right and the far left are statist. And more broadly, liberalism and populism aren't just competing in some sense electorally, they are fueling each other, and you might even go further and say they're actually collusive and complicit, because they always need each other. They always will, use the other one as legitimation for their own position. We're saying that the liberals protect us against the populists, just like the populists free us from the liberals. Okay, so this is clearly a form of complicit collusion that we can all, I think, identify. And in concrete terms, Trump fuses nativism with libertarian economics, and the other side of that is sort of more neoliberalism in one country based on tax cuts for the rich and deregulated finance. And then the marginalized masses can be bought off with a combination of a bit of militarism, protectionist trade war with China, and prescription drugs. So you could say, to put it very simply, Wall Street is on steroids while thousands die from opioids. And state capitalism elsewhere in the world is similarly paradoxical. Socialism with Chinese characteristics is, of course, a euphemism. Right? For what? For the fusion of nationalism with economic liberalism, right? Which is now also being exported to other parts of the world. This is the model that China promotes in Africa and elsewhere. And this Chinese hybrid of brutal market competition, coercive state control, and a surveillance society is perhaps becoming the new norm. So the battle is not just between liberalism and populism in the West, right? It is about something altogether more fundamental. Now the philosophy underpinning sort of contemporary liberalism and some of the anti-liberal insurgents, which I think is a better word than populist, is a variant of transhumanism. That's really what I want to focus on for much of the remainder of this. So what is transhumanism? Very simply, it's the idea that humanity is so deficient that it needs technological enhancement. Politically, that's an ideology that essentially gives up on work, it gives up on place, it gives up on institutions, and instead favors leisure, cyberspace, and networks. So instead of human labor and creativity, it's now technological innovation algorithms that will govern the economy. And a sort of transnational multitude, as imagined by Hart and Negri, will replace the working class and nation states. Citizenship and democratic resistance against state-based capitalism will give way to the new leisure class of passive consumers living off a universal basic income. That's the sort of dystopian utopia we promised, and here's another paradox for you. But it's not just technology that is an engine of growth and social advancement. Rather, human enhancement really aims to upgrade physical and mental performance, postpone aging, and even overcome mortality. And this is where you can see how this utopia is deeply dystopian. It threatens to abolish the humanist commitment to equal value and dignity of all human beings, whatever their physical attributes, whatever their intelligence, whatever nature has made them to be, or culture has also made them to be. So now we have genetic manipulation, the fusion of humans with machines, and artificial intelligence, all raising the prospect of different categories of human beings and of a post-humanist species. This really is a revival of eugenics. And it might be worth here remembering Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, remarking the following upon reading The Origin of the Species. Galton wrote this: "Could not the undesirables be got rid of and the desirables be multiplied?" This is the sort of thinking I think we're seeing now under you guys. And the philosophy underpinning it is transhumanism, and more specifically accelerationism. This idea that both nature and humanity should be superseded by a new Promethean spirit. That is the language the accelerationists use. They want to bring about a new Promethean spirit. So we have a convergence, and this is in the work of Nick Land, Ray Brazier, and all sorts of other contemporary accelerationist philosophers. Convergence of nanotech, biotech, infotech, and cognitive science, which serve to essentially liberate individuals and the masses, not just from the constraints of capitalism, but more fundamentally from the limits of nature and history altogether. So the natural order and traditions are seen as arbitrary, irrational restrictions on our free mind. And a Promethean politics, in the words of Alex Williams and Nick Sirnech, is actually, as they define it, the maximal mastery over society. That is how they view a properly Promethean politics. So here you might say libertarian freedom really does mean totalitarian control. So humanity and the universe are by nature deficient and require technological completion. That's the first point. The second point is that the individual, released from all constraints, can now be whatever he or she wants. So this is really taking sort of self-realization to a whole new level. And the third thing is this unabashed social Darwinism, right, under you guys, where individual will and the power of the strong and the wealthy will essentially govern our world. But it's not just the anti-liberals or the libertarians who do this. There's also liberal transformers. Now let's not forget, the CEO and founder of Facebook likes to talk about moving fast and breaking things, as if somehow all disruption is always and everywhere positive. And this goes with the whole myth of the Enlightenment about linear progress being a good thing and having to be on the right side of history. Now we also have the tech platforms and, of course, new forms of surveillance capitalism. There's a very good book that's just come out by Shoshana Zuboff on the age of surveillance capitalism, which she associates primarily with Western tech platforms, but I think could be again extended to the Chinese model as well. And then, of course, you have liberals favouring liberalising euthanasia and sex changes for minors without any parental agreement, as is already the case in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Norway. And if you allow people to die as they wish, or if you allow them to change their sex as they please, then that really is to subordinate the intrinsic value of human life to free choice and just individual happiness. And here you see the outgrowth of utilitarianism. Because wasn't it Saint-Simon who said that we should move from the self-government of the people to the administration of things? And now, of course, the next step is the governance by number. And this is really where we are with this sort of thinking. So what is being legitimated here is not some genuinely desirable democratic right of equality or dignity, far from it. Instead, what is being legitimated is the will to power of some over others, and essentially of the strong over the weak. Physically strong, mentally strong, and all other forms of strength that we can imagine. And if the unique value of each human person is not upheld, then nothing prevents ending the lives of children or adults deemed too ill, too frail, or simply too socially and economically useless. So here we have a biological totalitarianism in the making, based on the will of the individual and some pseudoscientific fanaticism. This completely ignores, a lot of warnings we came across in the early parts of the 20th century, for instance, by Aldous Huxley in The Brave New World, where he already made the point that control over reproduction is now more easily attained through self-release and promiscuity rather than self-discipline and fidelity. And the problem with this is not some sort of attempt to return to moralism, not at all. It's basically the point that now this allows the state to deal more directly with individuals without the mediation of couples and families or any other institutions that might stand in the way of this sort of state power or state-based capitalism. And we shouldn't forget either that Huxley was the one to warn that sexual permissiveness was the new opiate that covertly reconciles our contemporary culture to the loss of other freedoms, freedoms of the workplace, freedoms in our neighborhoods and nations, and indeed civil liberties, perhaps, in this day and age as well. And all of this, in turn, is reminiscent of what Tocqueville already identified as the tyranny of voluntary servitude. Not some despotism, not some 20th century type dictatorship, but it's the voluntary part that matters. As he says, a kind of servitude, ordered, mild, and peaceable, a singular power, tutelary and all-encompassing, end of quote. And of course, this also is captured in the work of Paul Piccone and Christopher Lasch, who talked about the fusion of the old elites with the new classes that isolate the establishment from the concerns of ordinary people. If that doesn't capture our politics today, I'm not quite sure what does. This is true for both the liberals and the populists. Neither represent our, I think, popular majorities in the different countries. And then finally, I come to perhaps the more explicitly theological dimensions of this and of paradox. So if, as I've tried to suggest, rampant individualism essentially begets a sort of authoritarian statism that we're now seeing, then we can also say that both of them are not the sort of paradox that we would defend theologically, because what's common to both is a denial of the paradoxically reciprocal hierarchies that you find in many different social orders across cultures and civilizations. A sort of paradoxical combinations of the intellectual and the manual, of the aristocratic or the monarchic with the popular, and indeed of high culture with folk culture. What you have with the other combinations, the sort of liberalism and populism I've spoken about, is precisely a denial of these, always in favor of something middle ground, always in favor of some sort of mediocrity, then sort of reinforced by social Darwinism. So this pattern of vertical reciprocity, the intellectual, the manual, the aristocratic, the popular, the high culture, and the folk culture, is what the purely horizontal axis of ultraliberalism and anti-liberalism excludes. These two collapse the hierarchical and mediatory axis of political culture into a just horizontal, flat space, the false binaries of left and right, the state and market, and individual and collective, as I've said. And of course, this is exactly what the transhumanists want. They want a plane of singular immanence. Right? They want this completely flattened space where there are no relationships, no institutions that mediate, just essentially a direct access of the individual to this technology that somehow completes our humanity. So this then, of course, excludes all the paradoxes that are necessary for proper human flourishing, right? A paradoxical combination of the spiritual and the material, transcendence and immanence, divine and human. And so we're left with something which is a new form of voluntary totalitarianism, to which, of course, the alternative is simply to remember that you need paradox. You need, for instance, the paradox of fraternity saving equality and freedom, because you cannot have proper freedom and equality without a sense of lived solidarity, because ultimately what binds us together is what makes us free and what makes society more just. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adrian. So our final paper written by Peter Paik from Yonsei University and University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His paper is entitled "Nihilism, Triumphant: Why there will not be a new awakening."
Okay, let me explain the really bleak title. I will be talking in this paper not about what I hope is true, but rather what I am betting will be the case. I'm Christian, but in surveying contemporary society, I find myself obliged not to ask what would Jesus do, but rather what would Julian the Apostate have made of things. So in keeping with the spirit of Wayne Hudson's talk, I propose that what we understand as Christianity and as secularism have in actuality a different meaning from their conventional definitions. So I will introduce two hypotheses. The first is that Christianity, historically speaking, was actually Christianity plus paganism, a paganism which Christianity had internalized, and which enabled a very apocalyptic religion to be realist, as well as to develop a historical consciousness, as well as historical depth. And that this is, the pagan element of Christianity is actually what has been depleted in the modern age, and this is the reason why I think the church is in crisis. Second hypothesis is that secularism does not exclude the sacred, nor does it entail disbelief and disenchantment. The absence of belief in God is perfectly compatible with the drive to treat the self as sacred. And so the therapeutic care of the psyche is ultimately a form of the divinization of the self. So I say that we are in the midst of a cultural revolution in which the fundamental values of society are up for grabs, and modern civilization itself is poised to undergo what I think are going to be very lasting changes. And the principal indication for me for this upheaval is the shift in contemporary liberalism from the project of modus vivendi, which is the effort to enable people with different beliefs and belonging to different groups living peacefully side by side, to the drive to enforce a set of interlocking stances that are not to be questioned. Right, so the idea of violence has been extended from actions to thoughts and feelings, which of course has magnified the possibilities of conflict in everyday life. Now, more than a century ago, George Santayana described liberalism as an adventitious principle, a mere loosening of an older structure. We have reached at present the point where this older structure of religion and tradition has entirely come apart. The success of liberalism in vanquishing and dissolving all the beliefs and intuitions that had restrained it and resisted it has left liberalism with a task that it cannot perform, right, which is to provide norms, values, and standards that are necessary for the foundation and maintenance of a positive order. The fact that liberalism today has turned into a persecutory orthodoxy is a sign of its inability to move beyond the criticism of old values and traditional moralities. But the deadlock of secular liberalism is summed up by Philip Rieff in his declaration that no culture can survive without the support of a predicative sacred order. A culture that has lost its grounding in the sacred is one that breaks apart into fragments that particular groups and interests manipulate in order to assert their own fiction of primordiality against other fictions in a war of self-legitimating elites. The culture wars are, in other words, the consequence of the disintegration of the sacred order internalized by culture. But it is, of course, highly unlikely that a society can go on unraveling in a sort of interminable process. Right? Religious faith may appear to be a necessary corrective to this vacuum in values created by liberalism. But the problem is that progressive liberalism is not the antagonistic other of Christianity, but is in fact its ideological offspring. This has meant that Christianity is in many respects defenseless against the critiques of progressive liberalism. Indeed, the principal reason why a revival of Christianity will not take place, in my view, is that progressive liberalism has become ascendant is not contrary or distant enough from Christian orthodoxy for the latter to serve as a corrective to it. Right? So progressive liberalism may direct intense animus toward Christianity, but it does not do so as a way of rejecting and breaking with Christian morality, but rather out of the aspiration to express a more enlightened form of Christianity. So liberalism condemns the church for having tolerated hatred, prejudice, and discrimination, and having committed repeated crimes against humanity over its long history. Of course, these kinds of moralistic attacks are nothing new since the time of Voltaire, but they have a kind of efficacy today that they didn't have earlier in European history. Right? So this is, of course, the critique that Christianity is totalitarian or authoritarian because it hasn't lived up to its billing as the religion of love. So the condemnations of religious violence, frequently take Christianity, for example, as the most guilty of faith-driven cruelty. right? And it has, I think, served as a kind of scapegoat. And I guess maybe I'll just say quickly as an aside that I would say that this, in part, is the sort of the hostility toward Christianity stems from the very success of modern society in eliminating suffering. Right? That suffering is hated, as Nietzsche said, more than ever before, and that this hostility towards suffering has actually been directed towards biblical teachings, especially the one on sexuality. Right? I mean, and this is where Christianity has been the most vulnerable, because to endorse biblical teachings on sexuality has become tantamount to expressing hatred. I don't have the time to get into the clashes over sexuality in the church and the broader culture, so I will limit myself to the observation that chastity is the virtue that Christians themselves have become the least willing to defend, as well as the disposition whose value they have come to understand the least. So it is a startling spectacle to see contemporary liberalism turn with such outrage and fury against the religion that provided liberalism with its philosophical foundations and spiritual foundations. Okay, so this is, but of course, I mean, when we think about go back to my earlier definition of Christianity as Christianity plus paganism, and when we consider the pagan element, I think this throws into relief the kinds of moves and possibilities I think that are revealing themselves. Because certainly the pagans would have scorned and derided liberal humanitarian morality as more perverse and more morbid than the church itself. Right? As the former would not allow for any kind of realism, including the recognition that violence is necessary to defend the state. So it's actually the virtues and intuitions of the pagans that equip us with a coherent and alternative perspective by which we may measure cultural and spiritual distances. Right? The church as an institution, of course, came about through its engagement and acceptance of many of the beliefs of the pagan world, not least Greek philosophy and Roman law. And it's through its engagement with paganism that the church gained for itself space for action in the world. Right? And so what is truly other than to progressive liberalism is paganism, right? From which it stands at an even greater distance. And so the liberal critique of Christianity, in a sense, refuses to accept as excessively dark the insights into human nature shared by the Christians and the pagans alike. Right? That human beings are in need of authority and laws to restrain their cruel and destructive tendencies. However, the effort to root out any restraints and limitations on individual behavior in liberalism does not represent a return to the pagan world. Pagan faith, in the words of Grief, teaches no moralities, nor does it teach immoralities. Instead, progressive liberalism represents a step further in the pathways opened up by the Christian religion. Right? And in this case, what eliminates the idea of sin or turns it into an institutional issue that can actually then be abolished by human efforts. Moreover, the waning of paganism within Christianity would have had to unfold within the church in order for progressive liberalism to become culturally ascendant in the first place. And this would explain the hesitancy and confusion with which Christians confront humanitarian morality that indicts them in terms that would otherwise be reserved for fascists. Right? So in that sense, I mean, Christians do take the critique very seriously, and I would say that this is actually kind of an Achilles heel, right? Because it stems from a lack of awareness of one's own evil. Right? I'm thinking of the rebuke given to Alden Pyle in The Quiet American by the narrator, the British narrator, which is that I wish you sometimes had a few bad motives. You might understand a little more about human beings. So the grand and possibly fatal tragedy of modern Christianity is to have lost its sense of evil. Right? It has deteriorated into what Nietzsche has called an exhausted opiate Christianity that has lost its dreadfulness and is no longer capable of inspiring the searching, struggling, daring, wanting to stand alone, or for Pascalism, that brooding self-contempt, that belief in human unworthiness. Right? It has become a religion that is too blended with the very culture that seeks to eradicate it, and is undermined by the paralyzing spirit of the times, in which we are driven to be endlessly self-critical while being cut off from any possibility of self-correction. Nevertheless, progressive liberalism can only be an interregnum, a carnival that is unthinkable without the massive rise in financial debt and the prodigious squandering of social capital that has sustained it. And so even many secular individualists find it unbearable to live without direction provided by norms, standards, and prohibitions. Right? The constant strain of living without a clear direction in which to orient one's efforts and strivings has led to high rates of mental illness, especially among the elites. Right? So there's an interesting passage from Baudrillard's Ecstasy of Communication that in many ways foresees the predicament created by social media, which is that we are suffering from a forced extroversion of all interiority, right? So that which creates a new kind of schizophrenia through imminent promiscuity and the perpetual interconnection of all information and communication networks, right? So we suffer from an over proximity of things, right? In which we feel that there are no boundaries that we can set up to protect us from, from the culture that makes us free, right? Now, even if liberals see the good of such things as moral consensus, social cohesion, and self-discipline, they do not wish to return to the beliefs and traditions that made them possible for earlier generations. They want restraints and prohibitions, just not the ones with which they are familiar. The main reason for rejecting traditional prohibitions is the fact that they forbid one from divinizing the self. But there is a way to reinstate norms and standards that, while preserving the prerogative of sacralizing the self, right, which would enable, in some sense, the liberal project to continue, right, and also it's the project to democratize self-esteem, right, and that is sacrifice. So here I'm outing myself as a kind of a renegade reader of René Girard, right? He thinks that sacrifice is no longer effective. In my research, I'm making the argument that, in fact, when you change the fundamental values of civilization, sacrifice will regain efficacy, right? And so I find myself moving back into this kind of cyclical model of history and culture, kind of, in some ways sort of in spite of myself. But I think there are a lot of indications in the culture where such wild possibilities can suddenly become thinkable. Right? I mean, Tocqueville says that that's one of the properties of living in revolutionary times. Right? Is that what we would regard as inconceivable can actually become, possible and binding on us. I give as one example. I don't know if anyone's familiar with the novel that was made into a popular series, The Leftovers, right? Which is about the sort of the sudden disappearance of millions of people, right? But it happens totally randomly, right? It's not like the Christian rapture, right? So Vladimir Putin and Jennifer Lopez both disappear. but what happens?
Which one is worse?
But what the collective trauma does is it actually creates a cult that engages in sacrifice, but because they do it through the framework of consent, it becomes impossible for liberal society to actually counter it. Right? It doesn't have the means to prevent the practice of a ritual that in some sense takes place, below, sort of the radar of its very of a rationalistic account of human freedom. And so, how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Oh, 2 minutes. Okay. Well, so I will I'll try to sum things up here. And so and this is where I think Nietzsche is right about sacrifice and Girard is not. Which is that for Nietzsche, sacrifice is not just about killing other people, it's actually sacrificing parts of ourselves, right? So we can sacrifice our intelligence, we can sacrifice our prudence, right? We can sacrifice our virtues. And that what this does, especially when it's done in a kind of counterintuitive way, is that it enables us to feel divine, right? As Baudrillard would say, it puts us into circuits that where we can experience reversibility. Right, and that I think what is at the heart of the experience of the divine in this very heretical sense is this experience of reversibility. In the novel, one form that this reversibility takes is that people start dating each other that they would never have dated before the catastrophe. Like there's a fundamental change in everyday tastes, right? And so what of course takes place is that in changing something so kind of innocuous and everyday, nevertheless is that these shifts amount to little victories over ourselves, right? That in some sense we can partake of a kind of action that has a significance that goes beyond our desires, right? And I think this is what liberalism ultimately will what will shipwreck liberalism is the fact that people want something more significant than their desires. Just to kind of quickly wrap up, so at the end of this paper, I talk a bit about Baudrillard and this issue of fate, right? That it's fate that fills us with significance, and it is fate that we long for, right? When we are told that we should constantly construct our lives around choice. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, well, thank you very much for a very rich panel. Type of question?
Just one point that I picked up from Adrian, who was talking about cycles, and cycles count in the last. If you go back to traditional political theory, it's constructed in cycles. So you get Caldunian cycles, you get Palladian cycles. Even you get decline and fall of empires. Now it seems to me that liberalism is a sort of Faustian bargain that human beings can somehow escape the cycles of nature, that they can go beyond, even though the cycles of nature continue. So you get a bit of this, I think, in Mill with the innovative living, that you can somehow build and build and build. And it strikes me that what's happening now with the Dark Enlightenment and so on is that this is the next stage through which human beings can go to escape. They're so frightened that nature will reclaim them in some shape or form that they need to have ways of moving beyond nature. Because the Palladian cycle still claims this. I think politics is makes much more sense for Palladian cycles than in other ways. And they've also, something else which goes with this Dark Enlightenment so forth, is this constant fear, for example, we're going to be hit by an asteroid, or the volcano is going to knock us out. There's a constant sense that what we've built is fragile. But we can still do it. If we only have the right technology and we continue our individuals, we can escape it. Hopefully we can build a planetary defence that will knock out the asteroid before it gets here. So, this battle against cycles seems to me to be important as an aspect of the modern liberal emancipation.
Well, I think that's fascinating, Greg, and I think very perceptive. And it goes beyond political theory to economics, because the constant promise of liberal economics is to free us from the cycles of boom and bust. By somehow, having a model that will get us to the point where, we can have, infinite growth and so on. So I think that's very, very, very important. I mean, I would just add, I think there's also something internal to contemporary liberalism, again, not the whole liberal tradition, but certainly contemporary liberalism, and that's a sort of apparatic oscillation between control and release. Between, on the one hand, saying there's a sort of state of nature from which we're desperately trying to escape through the social contract, while actually in real life bringing about the very state of nature that was just a theoretical, supposition. So the very Hobbesian world of a war all against all is precisely what you have a brutal market competition. Right? And then the state comes in and sort of either regulates a bit or reinforces the market by eliminating obstacles to it. So, there's a strange apparatic oscillation within liberalism. But I think this escape from the cycles, I think, is very, very well put. And I think it's really that fantasized escape from history and nature both at once, which is a really striking thing, where again, you see the paradox of a utopia, though liberalism starts off as an anti-utopian project, freeing us from the horrible utopias of communism and fascism and National Socialism. Fine, you can see the liberal resistance to them. But liberalism in its contemporary guise has actually turned into a new form of utopianism. It's the best of all possible worlds, which actually brings about in real life, a dystopian sort of experience for us all. So I agree.
Marsha?
Yeah, I had a comment for Adrian and kind of humorous comment, but question for Peter. First, I want to say, Adrian, I like your paper a great deal, and there's much more about this in a, here comes the plug, chapter that Adrian has written for an edited volume based on a conference that Telos supported a number of years ago. So if you want, that will be out in the fall. So you can hear more on Adrian on this topic. And I think it's very important, for us to, Adrian, as you said, to make the distinction between something like having a kneecap replacement so you can continue to work and enjoy your family and take a walk in the park and so on, from this transhumanism that you have described. The only thing that, the thing that I would add, perhaps or just comment on, is that this will be expressed and sold, so to speak, transhumanism, differently in different cultures, right? There's going to be a situated contingency to the way this is going to be expressed in Chile or Hungary or Poland or the UK. So for example, as you just said when you remarked that the state can withdraw from the market, since in the United States, the far right or various terms of populisms advertise themselves as non-statist, right? The government recedes, small governmentism, reduced taxes. Transhumanism will get sold, so to speak, as an aspect of the private healthcare market. Yeah, so we should be sensitive to the different ways in which these things are expressed and then soaked up by the receptors of the culture. That was just to add comment. Peter, so to not what would Jesus do, and I ask myself, what would Amos and Jeremiah do? That's my question. And my question, since Christianity, as you said, has provided much of liberalism with its concepts, my response was, yeah, but not necessarily. In other words, Christianity doesn't have to go to liberalism or neoliberalism. It can, but there are other aspects of Christianity, as we know historically and also theologically and theoretically, that go in other directions. So especially in helping people, here's your conclusion, become involved with something greater than their own material or proximate desires. And I wondered if you had anything to say about resources within Christianity to go there rather than to some vicious neoliberalism.
Well, sure. I mean, I think it's a very rich tradition, and obviously there are many different forms of belief and practice. It's just that I think that the alternatives are not going to be strong enough or attract, attract a significant number of people, like, say, who are have initiative and are enterprising to be able to make that much of a difference. I've come around to sort of maybe the very reluctantly to Nietzsche's view that, well, maybe we've seen, we're seeing the end of the tremendous effects that religion could have on people's lives. And our technology really, makes it superfluous, right? I mean, we can, it serves as a kind of a substitute, right, for the kinds of, it enables people to avoid the kinds of experiences that certainly Nietzsche saw in a non-opiate Christianity, right? Which, the modern world helps us to escape suffering, right? And so in some sense to revive Christianity would, I think, involve a fundamental repudiation of the modern world in a way that would, sort of take us in the direction of Kaczynski. I don't know if there's an interesting article in New York Magazine a couple months ago, which goes into how a lot of people have actually read the Unabomber's manifesto, and these are people who are professionals who have given up middle-class lives and are learning how to find mushrooms right in the forest, and so I think it will require something fundamentally radical in the West. It seems to me that even as there's a cyclical principle at work, there are also certain things that are that have happened that are irreversible, right? I mean, we can, just because we can personally go back into the past and find something that satisfies us, it doesn't mean that the person next to us will find that similar and that find similar satisfaction, and that I think we're basically, we have to cope with a very different symbolic terrain.
Way
I think I'm probably speaking for Julian the Apostate. It's not common anymore to say anything in favor of Julian the Apostate, because Julian the Apostate believed in three sons, three physical sons, and that was part of his attempt to unite Christianity and paganism on a correct spiritual conception of nature. Now, what I don't like about any of our speakers, although I love them all dearly, is that you all make a pretty easy point, which Greg repeats, the idea that in some sense liberalism is an attempt to escape from nature. Well, it's true, but it's not only the beginning. The problem with everything you say is that you don't have a philosophy of nature, not one of you, and you certainly don't have a spiritual philosophy of nature. Julian the Apostate did, and if Christianity provides a new philosophy of nature grounded in the current sciences but totally transcending them for the reasons that Peter signals, well then we'll get rid of liberalism in the bad sense, certainly we will. It's monstrous nonsense, but we'll keep the spiritual content of liberalism, which comes, as everybody says, out of the Christian stream. And the point is, you do have to start in the philosophy of nature and have a spiritual philosophy of nature. If you have an 18th century mechanical philosophy of nature, that way lies disaster. If you agree with Hobbes, that way lies disaster. But just as a final thing, although I myself always attacking liberalism, I don't like the anti-liberalism in our conference because you don't define it either. And you muddle up Hobbes, who isn't a liberal, with modus vivendi, which is an extremely important conception in Pufendorf, and is certainly not irrelevant to any country in the world now, because it's a way of reconciling conflict. And you take the junk French conceptions of liberalism. But all clever people don't buy French conceptions of liberalism, and all clever people do buy modus vivendi, including President Xi and Putin. So let's clear away this drivel about liberalism and define it, notice the differences, and defend the good ones. And then let's come back to theology, but theology has to be about the spiritual nature of the reality we're in. And that is what theos means.
Let me just go ahead and move on to more questions.
Yes. Yes. So I'm wondering from the first three speakers about the social forces that they believe are giving rise to the Dark Enlightenment. I suspect that there is similar to the social forces that Marcia mentioned, the end of American empire, the end of white dominance, white hegemony, and particularly this. I think it's further than a fear of the cyclical nature of history and politics and nature, and really rather more the fear of the end of power, right? But I'm wondering your thoughts specifically about that.
Okay.
So I want to address this to Peter, although I think Adrian and Tim might also have some thoughts about it. Is the effort around the divination of the self, and presumably of the body. We now have the transgender movement, which seeks to reconfigure understandings of gender in the body. And is that kind of an aspiration of divinization where, regardless of what presumably God gave you or what nature gave you, you're going to do it yourself and aspire to your own divinity and do your own re-engineering?
So maybe Courtney and Tim respond.
So I want to respond to all three briefly. To Wayne, I think the turn towards an environmentalist left. I don't think the Green New Deal is just an excuse to smuggle in free healthcare and free college education. I think it's actually a recognition that the world we are living on is in crisis in an unprecedented way, and that we need to rethink our political relationship to nature. And I think in some ways it's actually time to see nature perhaps as actively hostile rather than as something that we can control, but therefore as requiring solidarity among humanity. To Valerie, I think you're absolutely right that there's a fear of loss of power. But I also think that we live, and this is where it gets too easy to say, but we live in an alienated society, and people are looking for sources of meaning, and people are turning to their idea of cultural homogeneity to ground their connection to each other, because in no small part the connections that they previously had, and here I'm doing the bowling alone thing, right? But the connections that they previously had are breaking down. And so I think it may be the task of religion, but it may be the task of a left politics rather than a right politics to reach out and give people something to belong to, something to bind themselves to, as Adrian so aptly put it, so that they don't turn to racism as that source. And then finally to Ken, I consider the transgender movement in some ways as very similar to the idea that you were having yesterday about membership in, call it the Black community, as voluntary covenant. I think people who are transgender see themselves as belonging to a mode of being in our sort of semantic understanding of what communities are as a formation of solidarity. And in that sense, what they want is to be part of forms of recognition among people that, again, and here's where I come back to it, that can ground community, can ground solidarity. And so I don't think that this is a turn towards denial of the body so much as a recognition that the way that we structure society is in terms of gender, but that the communities then centered around these gender categories don't always capture the aspirations and the virtues that each side, or that individuals not falling into any of the sides, would want to embody. And so it's the pursuit of virtue through the gender categories our society has.
Well, more than something. All right. A quick answer, I don't know. In one sense, yes, I think not only the environmental left but the environmental right, that there are hard greens, conservatives who defend there's a crisis in nature. That in some ways these ideas about transhumanism fail because they're very like the destruction of nature and anthropocentric. You can save humanity, but if you don't save insects and trees and biosphere that goes along with it, then you're sort of in trouble. Therefore, if you have this unpredictable nature that's evolving, it makes sense to have perhaps some unpredictable alter evolutionary mode of being that exists. And that's where some of it goes. In many ways, I think it's just a continuation of the rationing of status, class, and power. Instead of living in the metropole, you're going to live on the internet, and you have the power to do it. And you may survive as download your soul into the internet after the singularity, and everybody else who doesn't have the trillions and the high voltage to do it is left back to rot on Earth. The other point about transgender is really interesting in the sense that to what extent is in the current modes of power, so much of power and status, privilege is, I guess you could say, its semantics is somatic. So to become with this, to feel the meaning of these things, one can begin to engineer one's body. Transgender is one. Globally, there are phenomena of people who aren't white, whatever, light being, white being, that kind of, whatever, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, to appear to be less non-white. And by the same token, there are the affectations of people who are, really working class trying to, code themselves as less working class by the way that they, organize their somatic being. So I think that kind of interpolation of power into the body as the apparent representation of power, mostly on screens, on the selfies, on the Facebook, all that kind of stuff. But then furthering that into the engineering of the body itself by whatever means people in a limited way have now is an intriguing puzzle. I don't know what, to me, it raises a really interesting question, and we can explore further that looks at that again, a fusion of the codes of power and the cellular constraints of necessity.
First to validate, I think it's a really, really important question, but I don't think a lot of good sociology has been done on this, is at least the sense I get. And I think it's a combination of, if you look at it in terms of alt right and far left, yes, clearly on the alt right, the racism is there to see. There's absolutely no, it's not secret, it's not hidden, it's completely explicit. But I think some of the libertarians on the far left don't use that, and yet I think they come to worryingly similar conclusion, which is again, it's the cult of the strong, the powerful, the wealthy. And this is, I think, where this converges, that it may as well start, in different places. And I think in the end, this is very much about trying to dissolve all sorts of human institutions and relationships that make us who we are, right? That make us the sort of both frail and resilient creatures we are. And I think that's the really worrying thing here, that these forms of social organization talk all about freedom and choice, and yet it's just the opposite. It's a form of totalitarian control. Whether it's tech monopolies or some form of state surveillance, like social credits and so on, that we're seeing. I think we end up in a very, very similar place. But I think you're right, the starting points are different, and probably there's a sociology there that I think needs to be written. To Wayne, I couldn't agree more about the need for a spiritual philosophy of nature. That's absolutely right and beautifully put. And I don't quite agree about, sort of what you describe as the anti-liberalism. It's not an anti-liberalism as much as a critique of liberalism, which is still the dominant, if not the hegemonic, ideology. And also, it's not just repeating what some French scholars may have said about liberalism in the past. There's lots of Anglo-Saxon stuff, from Larry Seaton-Top to Helena Rosenblatt, and lots of people who write about the history of liberalism in very, very important ways that I think is, while we can debate each and every genealogy, there's something in Hobbes which has also shaped the liberal tradition. That doesn't say that Hobbes is a liberal, but clearly Hobbes has had, a contribution to liberal thinking around, the social contract and state power, etc. The same would be true for Locke and all sorts of other figures. But I think the key point is it's not anti-liberalism that is being articulated so much as an alternative to both the liberalism and the anti-liberalism on the far left and the radical right. So I don't think it's anti-liberalism we're arguing for, certainly not myself, and I think I can speak in this particular case on behalf of my colleagues on the panel, or indeed in other panels as well. And finally, it is very much saying that, yes, liberalism in many ways is the outgrowth of Christianity, but I don't think we can just say that liberalism, in some sense, there's the good and the bad bit. That's always, dangerous, I think, dualism. Much rather is that liberalism turns a sense of sacred into something profane, and at the same time sacralizes what is profane. And so I think liberalism is generally a heresy, and in that sense there is no good part of it. But what there is in liberalism that is good is not liberal, it's precisely something else, it's hybrid. It's a little bit conservative, like in Burke and Tocqueville, it's Christian. But to say that someone has a good and bad liberalism, I would want to resist that. I think it's a heresy, and I think what's much better is to have a liberal, to have a Christian politics that is also defending the principles of liberality, which liberalism never invented. In fact, it inherited it, but I think it turned into heresy.
Peter, and then I guess regarding the transgender movement, I would say that there are a couple of issues that I would bring up. First is that I think there's a lot about gender dysphoria that we're still learning about. Right, and there is quite a bit of debate, I think, among transgender people themselves about whether surgical interventions are good or not. Right, but at the same time, if you look at the way that this issue is played out in the media, it's been very difficult for, say, people who had surgery and then regret it to put their, add their voices to the debate. Right, so
I think there's been kind of a pressure put on sort of the views of people who want to sort of question it, and so it's also played out in such a way that I think that the connection between transgender and transhumanism has actually been heightened as a result, right? So that if one group of people for certain biological reasons are permitted to change and modify their bodies, how's that to stop the, that in some sense that strengthens the case of the very wealthy, right, to, to use like all kinds of procedures to improve, their physical condition. So I wish that this debate could proceed in a kind of a more, sort of a rational and calm way, but that just does not seem possible, right, in the current society. All right, if you can get the last word.
Just first, my apologies for coming this late. And Peter, my question to you springs from sort of a concern of the analysis that excludes such extraordinary swaths of humanity. What would you do with the 600 million Pentecostals in Africa and the diaspora? They're actually in the process now of reconstructing civil society. You've got 600 million of these people, right? They go from zero at the beginning of the century to 600 million. And in a place that I would easily write off, Lagos, Nigeria, which is a piece of work, the Pentecostal churches are actually building cities and attempting, and how do we integrate 600 million people trying to reconstruct civil society in the most, in places where the level of abject suffering is inconceivable? Quick point on this. For another example, the Kibera slums in Nairobi, Kenya, where it takes almost an hour and a half to get from a road into the Kibera slum, which makes the worst sections in Haiti look like a French Prince of Bel-Air. How is your analysis? There is this political movement that's practicing a form of conservative in the liberation theology. How's that feel?
What you're saying gives me what you're saying gives me a great deal of hope. I really welcome it and I applaud it. In my analysis, the way in which it applies, I guess it applies in the one sense in which I'm a Marxist. Which is that what will happen when these people reach $40,000 GDP per capita? Right.
Fair enough.
What did Tocqueville said? Why do Americans not abuse their freedom? Right? They have enormous freedom, but they never abuse it. It's because it doesn't occur to them that they can. Right? I think in mass society, there's a certain value to ignorance, right, in maintaining social order.
I'd just like to thank Adrian for organizing the conference. He did a fantastic job.
On that note, I'd like lunch served.